Hey everyone, hi running coach and Hoka athlete Sage Kande here. The training analysis, or racing analysis we should say, things that might go into the Boston Marathon upcoming couple days. Boston Marathon, such a classic, long history, prestigious race, top men's elite field we're going to talk about today. Kipchoge, the world record holder, and it's, a little bit of a clickbaity title here, I'll admit. Why I think there could be a chance that Kipchoge might not actually win the Boston Marathon. It's very exciting. He's coming to race Boston. It's a marathon that's near and dear to my heart. And of course, Kipchoge is the greatest of all time, right? He's the GOAT. He has the world record. He won so many majors. He's by hands down class above the field. It would be crazy as a betting person, if I was a betting man, if I was putting money on a race, who would bet against Kipchoge, right? It would be foolish to bet against him. He should win, but there's some reasons why I think that there might be an upset. And there's some very talented runners in the men's field that deserve some credit. And there's also some very unique things about the Boston Marathon course that I think could change things up, right? It's not the same as Berlin or London or Rotterdam or the Olympic Marathon or a sub-2 project with a bunch of pacers, right? There's no pacers at Boston. That's the first thing. So running a time trial race, running the fastest time in human history, amazing accomplishment, it makes you the greatest of all time, but it doesn't always, there's no guarantees in distance running. It's a fickle sport. And with a course like Boston, and I have some experience there that I'd like to share and relive the glory days, is that it's very unique in terms of the hills, but also the weather, the time of the year. April in New England, it could be hit or miss. People have been nervously checking the weather forecast over the years, and that's really the first variable I'll talk about is the weather. Because it's point to point, because you're generally running from the west to the east, right? Hopkinton, it's a different climate there sometimes. The weather could change during the race, actually. You generally meander a bit. There's a little bit of a direction change in the Newton Hills, another direction change after the Newton Hills. So if you have a headwind, you kind of have it the whole way. If you have a tailwind, you kind of have it the whole way. And what we've seen with the record, it was set the Boston Marathon record, which is not world record eligible. Remember, this course is not world record eligible because of its point-to-point nature. It's not the net downhill. The uphills in the Newton Hills kind of make up for that net downhill. It's not because it's this big net downhill course. It's because of the point-to-point nature. They set the record on a big tailwind type of day, right? When I ran Boston, I've run Boston 3 times. I've had the privilege of towing the starting line as in the elite field, semi-elite field, top American field 3 times. I was on the front of the starting line next to Meb one year. I've only run Boston well once out of those 3 times. I didn't finish the Boston Marathon last time in 2018, and I felt like I was in really good shape. It was really sad and embarrassing. Actually, 65% of the elite men's field at the Boston Marathon in 2018 did not finish the race. I was kind of part of that statistic, I guess, because I was sub-elite. I had all the perks, we'll put it that way. No excuses, except elites, there's a different mindset. When you're going into an all-out marathon race, it's not like going into an ultramarathon where you have your rain jacket and you're going to stay warm. It was like all-out racing, no drag, no jacket that year. 2018 was in a unique weather year though, right? It was like 30-mile-an-hour headwind, 50K headwind, near freezing temperatures, pouring down sheets of rain. The elites, especially the elite men, succumbed to hypothermia, myself included. I've never been so cold in my life. I've done mountain ultras, run in pretty extreme conditions, and that Boston Marathon 2018, 65% of elite men dropped out. Now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen this year. It could be a little rainy. It's probably not going to be as cold. It's probably going to be quite a bit above freezing, which is generally good. It's not going to be too hot, not going to be too cold. That's generally good for fast conditions. That's generally good for a solid race. And the DNF rate, especially for the elite men, is generally lower. I'd actually say, and this is an interesting thing, with the elite field, they could run almost just as fast if it's 70 degrees and hot with a tailwind versus the average mid-packer or the average Boston runner will melt in 70 degrees. Elites can handle heat a lot better than most people. So, 70 degrees, they might not run, they'll run slower than if it was 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but which it looks like it's going to be closer to 50 degrees, but they don't run that much slower. Whereas someone running around 3 hours might get really dehydrated and run like a 320 or something like that and have a big meltdown. Elites tend to do very well. Now, the flip side was 2018, near freezing conditions. A lot of people around the 3 hour range ran PRs. A lot of people finishing mid-pack at Boston ran some of the best marathons of their lives. The headwind didn't matter as much. The cold temperatures didn't matter as much. And part of that is because of the drafting effect. So now, temperature aside, humidity aside, whether or not it's precipitating, precipitation also slows down elites to some degree. You generally want dry conditions, but weather in New England, it's fickle. It could be rainy. It looks like it is going to be rainy. Whether or not the headwind is that bad though, if it's manageable, if it's 10 to 15 miles an hour, even if it's a headwind, even if it's an east wind, the drafting effect is very, very important, especially for the lead pack, especially for guys like Kipchoge. Now, he's going to have some competitors to work with, and this could really determine the race because Boston, unlike Chicago or Rotterdam or Berlin or London or these flat uniform courses, Boston does roll a bit. Boston, like New York, it's rolling, right? And it's very unique because of the way the Newton Hills are positioned strategically in the race between about miles 16 to 20. That's when usually things start falling apart in any sort of marathon, but it gets exponentially worse. If you're having a bad day at Boston, you're going to really suffer in the Newton Hills, right? You're really going to suffer at Heartbreak Hill. So a lot of times with elite fields, we see breaks happen. A lot of times it comes down to the last 5K, the last 3 miles for the win, but a lot of times people make a break right after Heartbreak or right before Heartbreak. People try to time trial it, and it depends on the wind a lot with the elites because you got guys like Kipchoge running 440 mile pace, 250 kilometer pace. That's a significant amount of wind already just cutting through the air. The air resistance factor is huge for an elite, but when you amplify that with another 10 mile an hour wind, 12 mile an hour wind, that effect becomes even more drastic, right? It's an exponential increase with drag determined by your velocity, right? Whereas if you're back in the middle of Boston and you've got hundreds of people in front of you cutting the wind and you're running 6 or 7 minute mile pace, the headwind effect isn't going to be as drastic, and being able to cover a break doesn't matter as much. When I ran Boston, I'm instantly getting dropped. I said I was near the front of the starting line. I had all the perks, but those guys go out 440 first mile. I ran like a 5 flat first mile, I think. It's very downhill. We'll get to the hills later, but I was in the third chase pack back, and then I was in no man's land. This is when I finished Boston in 2015 and actually ran probably the best marathon of my life strategically. It wasn't the fastest time of my life because we had a 15 mile an hour headwind that day. It was actually cold. I was wearing hat and gloves the whole time, never took them off. It was cold going up Heartbreak Hill. But what I noticed is there's gaps for him. So, Kipchoge, these other top runners that are going to be in the pack, and we will mention them, Evans Chebet, Benson Kipruto, sorry if I'm pronouncing the names wrong, Gabriel Gia, and Lalisa de Cisa, a little rough here. I think those are the other favorites that could win if something happened, if Kipchoge has a really bad day. These guys are super strong, and we'll run through some of their credentials. But, there's going to be a pack of 10, 15 guys in the lead pack. They're going to be working together. It's going to be strategic, right? Elites don't think, I'm going to try to run a time trial race necessarily. Usually the pack stays together because of the drafting effect. Like I said, they're keeping an eye on each other. They're going to make a break later on in the race and see if it comes down to the last 5K. And that's a good strategy to do, but whether or not they actually go out at 203 pace or 202 pace or 2 flat pace, probably not 2 flat pace, they might go out at 205 or 206 pace, right? They might try to go just fast enough to drop the top American guys, but there's going to be a lot of moves made probably in the Newton Hills. That's a good place to make a break at Boston. So, I'm watching in my best race, 2015 Boston, there's huge gaps that form after this lead pack. So There's, you know, the lead pack, then there might be a 100-meter gap, and then there's a chase back, and then there's another 200-meter gap, then there's like the pack where I was in. I ended up getting 16th place, so I did pass some people, but there was a lot of no man's land running where you're fighting into that headwind. If there's a headwind, there's no one in front of you for hundreds of meters, and you're just, it's quiet. It's amazingly lonely out there on the Boston Marathon course, believe it or not, in some cases. So if any of these runners have a bad day and they fall off that lead pack, they're in no man's land, is what I'm saying. And they might get swallowed up by some of the top American runners, some of the straggler elites, we'll call them. No disrespect there, but that's kind of the nature of how it is. And it's very strategic if there's a headwind to draft. Now, the elevation profile, again, that makes Boston extremely unique. It's almost like Boston, the Boston Marathon is like the Western States 100 for trail ultras. If we were comparing marathons in the US, like Boston, to all other marathons, Boston's like, it has the prestige and history, much like Western States, but also because it's a net downhill race. There's a lot of downhill where you're just going down, down, down. And unlike Western States, Boston's not quite as extreme with elevation changes, but in terms of a flat marathon, it is kind of extreme. Now, all these guys, a lot of the guys that train in East Africa, they run on all sorts of hills. They run at altitude. They're calloused for hills, right? They could handle some uphills. The unique thing about Boston, in my experience, is the extended downhill in the first, especially the first 5K, but even the first 10K, there's a lot of downhill there. Then you got some leveling out, you got some rolling stuff through Wellesley, through the halfway point, screaming downhill at about mile 15, right before the Newton Hills. That's a dangerous mile to run too fast on, I will tell you that. But then the transition to 4 decently sized uphills, Newton Hills. There's a little dip sometimes in between each one. Then there's a significant downhill after heartbreak as well that people can make a move on. But if you misguide your pace just 10 seconds a mile, 5 seconds a mile too fast, and your quads start going, or some muscle cramps up in that first 10 miles, that first 16K downhill, you try to bank too much time, you're gonna really, really pay the price, probably in the Newton Hills, and if not in the Newton Hills, definitely in the last 8K or the last 5 miles at Boston, because that happens in any marathon race usually. People hit the wall or rig up in the last 10K. It's always tough. But at Boston, it could get exponentially tough. And when I had the first Boston I ran probably the second slowest marathon of my life, 2:24. I thought I was in 2:17 shape. We went out like we were in 2:17 shape. Perfect weather day. I knew I was in trouble when I started the Newton Hills at mile 16. That's how bad it was. And yeah, basically your legs are gonna hurt really bad, or you're gonna get really dehydrated. At the top of heartbreak, you're gonna know exactly where you stand, right? Mile 20, mile 21. Usually you kind of know what's gonna happen in that last 10K if things start falling apart. Sometimes you could hold off the wall till the last 5K, but usually at Boston, you know at the top of heartbreak is what I'll say. So I think Kipchoge will know, and we'll probably know, we might not know. I think it's gonna be a close race regardless. But like I said, there's a chance that some of these other runners, and if I had to bet, if someone was gonna upset Kipchoge, and again, this is a crazy bet to make because I mean, no disrespect to the GOAT. He's a Koros sponsored athlete. I could say I'm kind of teammates with Kipchoge and as well as Kilian Jornet. Koros, power to sponsor Koros. I'm gonna say it's Gabriel Gia. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. 203 guy. He's run 203 flat. I'm gonna say someone like him does have a chance at winning. Again, if I was a betting man, it would be crazy to bet against Kipchoge, but Gabriel Gia, Benson Kipruto, 204 guy, very good. And then we can't forget Evans Chebet. He's a 203 guy. He's won Boston. He's won New York. So he has experience on these hilly marathon courses. Whereas Kipchoge, from what we've seen so far, he's a time trial guy. Time trial race is a very different thing. People, look at the Runner's World Instagram, there was a comment, I'm like, will he break the record? And I was like, well, it really depends on the weather, first of all. But second of all, elites are not necessarily going for the time trial or for a record, right? They can't get the world record. It's not a certified course. is there a bonus for getting the Boston record? I mean, it was set on a big tailwind day. I don't know. It's usually not the goal. The goal is to win. It's to get first place. Whether or not it's a strategic race and it's a sit and kick race, that's usually more of what happens in these types of championship style races. But because it's Boston, because the weather's going to be not too hot, not too cold, it could be fairly fast conditions. And especially with the super shoe effect, you're seeing a lot of times and records being broken in the last 3 to 4 years, especially. So, Kipchoge's gone sub 2 in the sub 2 hour project. He's not going to have pacers this time. It's going to be interesting how things play out. But that's kind of my rant here. Again, don't mean any disrespect. These guys are all incredible athletes. I think, as long as it's not too cold and people don't get hypothermic, there won't be, hopefully, too many dropouts. But again, that 2018 Boston, 65% of the elite men's field dropped out of the marathon. Remember that. So, wishing everyone luck. If you're running Boston, I wish you the best of luck. Again, you could go a little fast in the first half, but just a tad. Don't try to bank time at Boston. Don't try to bank time on the downhills. Respect the weather, respect your nutrition and hydration, even more so than you would on a flatter marathon course, because it is less forgiving, and hopefully you've trained for those hills. If you're out there spectating, enjoy the moment. It's going to be an amazing event. Unfortunately, I won't be there to watch, but Boston, the city, the people, it's really the best. The history, such a great course, such a challenging course, and really exciting that the GOAT himself, Kipchoge, is going to be there. And again, most likely he's probably going to win, but there's a chance he might not because of those variables that I mentioned in this talk. So thank you so much for all your support on here. Comment below with your thoughts. Who do you think is going to win the Boston Marathon, men's and women's field? Again, I could do a whole separate video on previewing the women's field, but Kipchoge, world record holder. It's pretty amazing that he's coming out to run Boston. Usually world record holders haven't done that for decades. So comment below. What are your predictions? What do you think? What do you think of this analysis? Disagree with me. Keep it civil, hopefully. But thank you so much for all your support on here. Again, shout out to sponsor Koros, sponsor of Kipchoge himself. This is actually the Killian edition Apex 2 watch. But thank you again to all the Patreon supporters for making this channel possible. All subscribe, like these types of videos, share it across the internet. Hope you're doing well, and stay tuned for more VO2 Max Productions.